the property management industry, fair housing offenses are considered especially troubling. In the United States, a dedicated fair housing attorney, Leslie Tucker, provides case explanations and best practices. These are some cases.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fair Housing Insiders Case Files. We appreciate you supporting this channel. We bring you real fair housing cases with practical lessons for our amazing industry, property management. I'm your host, Jonathan Sarr. Today's case focuses on something all property professionals need to understand clearly: retaliation. Specifically, what happens when a tenant files a fair housing complaint and the housing provider responds by trying to evict them. So today, we're going to look at the case of United States versus Greenview Associates LP, a recent lawsuit involving alleged retaliation against a tenant who exercised their fair housing rights. Joining me is Leslie Tucker, our amazing fair housing attorney. Leslie, welcome.
Thanks, Jonathan. Glad to be here as always.
So let's start with the basics. What triggered this lawsuit?
So this case involves a tenant named Rafael who lived at Greenview Village Apartments in New Hampshire since 2019. In June of 2023, he filed a fair housing complaint with HUD alleging discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. The basis behind that particular complaint isn't really important in this lawsuit. So the day after he filed this HUD complaint, HUD notified the defendants, the management company, the regional manager, and the owner. And then several months later, the tenant received notice that his tenancy was being terminated, citing, alleged false information on his original rental application.
Okay. So what exactly were the grounds for terminating his tenancy?
The termination notice that he was served with stated that Rafael had failed to disclose 3 criminal convictions from 2005 related to a 2003 incident that occurred when he was 17 years old. And these convictions that are kind of the subject of this were all related to reckless driving.
Okay. So failing to disclose information on a rental application seems like legitimate reason to terminate a lease. So why was this reason considered to be improper?
Well, a few reasons, Jonathan. First, apparently the property did not typically conduct background checks on its current residents, which Rafael obviously was. So this appeared to be completely out of the ordinary. Second, the timing. And timing is always a huge factor in retaliation cases. According to the complaint, the background check was conducted very shortly after the HUD complaint was filed. Third, Rafael claimed that he did actually disclose this information to a leasing agent when he first applied for the apartment. Obviously we have no way of knowing back in 2019 whether this actually happened. But if a jury finds him to be credible, then that would certainly be even more evidence to suggest that this stated reason may not be the actual reason for the termination. And then lastly, requesting criminal records or even considering criminal records from 20 years ago, which is where we know how old these convictions were, particularly for nonviolent convictions, is generally seen as overly broad in scope. So even if the application did request this information and an applicant didn't answer it accurately, the question would likely be viewed as improper to begin with. So all those reasons combined, I think, were viewed as sort of supporting reasons, why this was viewed as retaliation.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for breaking that down. So what legal steps took place after that?
So after the notice of lease termination, the owner filed an eviction case in New Hampshire State Court. Around that same time, while this HUD investigation was ongoing, because remember, this began with a HUD complaint, the state eviction court concluded the case was over. And what the court concluded was that the judgment in favor of the tenant, of Rafael. The court found that the eviction constituted a per se violation of the state's fair housing law prohibiting retaliation. So that case was over. The HUD investigation is still going. And apparently during that investigation, the regional manager said something to the investigator along the lines of, I really need this investigation to end so that we can get rid of this tenant, which clearly didn't help the case either. So it's not entirely surprising that later that year, HUD issued a charge of discrimination, finding reasonable cause to believe that the defendants had retaliated against Rafael. And then that brings us to this case filed in federal court.
Wow. That's quite the domino effect there. So for our audience, our property management professionals, what should be their takeaway from this case?
The primary takeaway is that retaliation is a standalone violation of the Fair Housing Act. It's illegal to intimidate, to threaten, or interfere with someone because they've exercised their rights. And that includes filing a fair housing complaint with HUD. Even if a housing provider thinks that that initial complaint was unfair, unwarranted, unfounded, any adverse action taken after that can be interpreted as retaliation, especially if there's no consistent policy or credible justification to support that action.
Okay. Very clear. That's a very important takeaway for our audience. So trying to evict a tenant just after they file a complaint can put you in serious legal trouble. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely. I mean, it's about as basic as it gets. In this case in particular, the background check was not part of their standard operating procedure. The tenant had lived at the property for years at that point. Performing a background check after a complaint is filed and then using that information to pursue eviction can clearly appear retaliatory, particularly when there's evidence that maybe this tenant had already disclosed that information.
Okay. So what should management teams do to stay compliant?
A couple things, important things. Consistent policies. So if you conduct background checks, they should apply equally and consistently for everyone, whether all of your current residents and all of your applicants. That should apply across the board, however you do it. Document disclosures. So keep very clear records of your applicants, of any details and disclosures that they make during the application process. Avoiding immediate adverse actions. Mm-hmm. When a tenant files a fair housing complaint, an internal complaint, in any way exercises their rights. Consult legal counsel before you make any decisions regarding their tenancy. If sometimes termination may be warranted and the timing just happens to look bad, that does happen sometimes. Mm-hmm. Make sure that you have really good documentation to support your case in those situations before you do anything. And lastly, make sure that your team understands what retaliation looks like. Make sure they are trained and understand what that means and what the possible consequences of retaliation are.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like this was a very emotional response, possibly, versus the step-by-step that they should have taken. So nice way to outline us 4 key ways of how, as property management professionals, we can avoid the same situation. So thank you so much, Leslie. So, and I think it's a good reminder, not so much about just avoiding discrimination or retaliation, but just respecting the process. And you highlighted it amazingly, as always. Just that's the law. Everyone has a right to file complaints, and we need to give way to that. As a housing provider, it's our job just to respond appropriately, lawfully. So thank you for really highlighting the steps that we need to take. And that's it for today's case files. Thank you, amazing community, for being here. You guys are rock stars. Fair housing is your lifeblood, and you're crushing it every day. So thank you for tuning into this episode, as that's our job to you, is to keep you informed on what's going on out there. Make sure you subscribe and follow us. Stay informed, stay professional, stay fair. Take care, everyone.